the most darkened new God, the most darkened new gods, a most darkened new God, the most darkened new goddess, the most darkened new goddesses, a most darkened new goddess, the most darkened old God, the most darkened old gods, a most darkened old God, the most darkened old goddess, the most darkened old goddesses, a most darkened old goddess, the most darkened greater God, the most darkened greater gods, a most darkened greater God, the most darkened greater goddess, the most darkened greater goddesses, a most darkened greater goddess, the most darkened lesser God, the most darkened lesser gods, a most darkened lesser God, the most darkened lesser goddess, the most darkened lesser goddesses, a most darkened lesser goddess, the most darkened greater spirit, the most darkened greater spirits, a most darkened greater spirit, the most darkened lesser spirit, the most darkened lesser spirits, a most darkened lesser spirit, the most darkened major God, the most darkened major gods, a most darkened major God, the most darkened major goddess, the most darkened major goddesses, a most darkened major goddess, the most darkened minor God, the most darkened minor gods, a most darkened minor God, the most darkened minor goddess, the most darkened minor goddesses, a most darkened minor goddess, the most darkened superior God, the most darkened superior gods, a most darkened superior God, the most darkened superior goddess, the most darkened superior goddesses, a most darkened superior goddess, the most darkened inferior God, the most darkened inferior gods, a most darkened inferior God, the most darkened inferior goddess, the most darkened inferior goddesses, a most darkened inferior goddess, the most darkened ancestor God, the most darkened ancestor gods, a most darkened ancestor God, the most darkened ancestor goddess, the most darkened ancestor goddesses, a most darkened ancestor goddess, the most darkened descendant God, the most darkened descendant gods, a most darkened descendant God, the most darkened descendant goddess, the most darkened descendant goddesses, a most darkened descendant goddess, the most darkened descendant God, the most darkened descendant gods, a most darkened descendant God, the most darkened descendant goddess, the most darkened descendant goddesses, a most darkened descendant goddess, the most darkened transcendent God, the most darkened transcendent gods, a most darkened transcendent God, the most darkened transcendent goddess, the most darkened transcendent goddesses, a most darkened transcendent goddess, the most darkened future God, the most darkened future gods, a most darkened future God, the most darkened future goddess, the most darkened future goddesses, a most darkened future goddess, the most darkened present God, the most darkened present gods, a most darkened present God, the most darkened present goddess, the most darkened present goddesses, a most darkened present goddess, the most darkened past God, the most darkened past gods, a most darkened past God, the most darkened past goddess, the most darkened past goddesses, a most darkened past goddess, the most darkened God, the most darkened gods, a most darkened God, the most darkened goddess, the most darkened goddesses, a most darkened goddess, the most darkened half God, the most darkened half gods, a most darkened half God, the most darkened half goddess, the most darkened half goddesses, a most darkened half goddess, the most darkened vessel, the most darkened vessels, a most darkened vessel, the most darkened person, the most darkened persons, a most darkened person, the most darkened image, the most darkened images, a most darkened image, the most darkened belief, the most darkened beliefs, a most darkened belief, the most darkened thought, the most darkened thoughts, a most darkened thought, the most darkened word, the most darkened words, a most darkened word, the most darkened action, the most darkened actions, a most darkened action, the most darkened situation, the most darkened situations, a most darkened situation, the most darkened circumstance, the most darkened circumstances, a most darkened circumstance, the most darkened relationship, the most darkened relationships, a most darkened relationship, the most darkened number, the most darkened numbers, a most darkened number, the most darkened formula, the most darkened formulas, a most darkened formula, the most darkened symbol, the most darkened symbols, a most darkened symbol, the most darkened color, the most darkened colors, a most darkened color, the most darkened thing, the most darkened things, a most darkened thing, the most darkened way, the most darkened ways, a most darkened way, the most darkened place, the most darkened places, a most darkened place, the most darkened time, the most darkened times, a most darkened time, the most darkened event, the most darkened events, a most darkened event, the most darkened result, the most darkened results, a most darkened result,